Sansa Stark stood in the great hall of the Red Keep with her hands folded before her, fingers threaded together so tightly she could feel her knuckles ache. The torches set high on the stone walls flickered, casting long shadows across polished marble floors, illuminating the lords and ladies assembled to witness a moment that would reverberate throughout the Seven Kingdoms. There was a hush among the onlookers, a sense of suspended breath as if they could not decide whether to applaud or to avert their eyes from the spectacle. She felt her heart flutter in her chest. Her gown was sky-blue velvet, trimmed with silver thread along the bodice and sleeves, evoking the Stark colors in subtle homage to her northern heritage. The gold circlet placed gently on her brow signified her new station, or at least the promise of it, betrothed to the heir to the Iron Throne, the crown prince of the realm, Joffrey Baratheon. This had happened so quickly, swifter than a falcon's dive. One moment, King Robert Baratheon had been considering the betrothal between his son and the daughter of his old friend, Lord Eddard Stark, as something for the future. The next, he was insisting that the wedding happen in haste. Whispers claimed it was Cersei Lannister's desire to secure the union before any whisper of compromise or other alliances might undermine her son's future. Others said it was Robert's guilt or urgent sense of forging deeper bonds with Ned Stark, the man he still called brother in arms. Only the gods knew the truth, and they did not speak it in mortal tongues. Sansa dared not turn her head to where her father stood, for fear of betraying the swirling tide of emotions that raged within her: hope, dread, excitement, and a quiet, gnawing fear. She remembered her father's furrowed brow, the lines of worry etched into his features when he'd said, "We do what we must, Sansa. Your mother trusts me to act for the best of our house." And she had nodded, tears pricking her eyes, not because she objected to becoming queen one day, but because she sensed this was no simple dream of songs and fairy tales. This was a maneuver, a means to preserve the Stark position at court, to ensure that House Stark held fast to whatever goodwill remained between the North and the Iron Throne. The hush lasted until King Robert rose, wreathed in shadow and torchlight, his face a tapestry of conflicting emotions: fondness for Ned, lingering regret for all the ghosts of his past, and a simmering impatience to see matters settled. He announced the betrothal in a voice that carried to the corners of the hall. Joffrey stepped forward, a slender youth with regal finery, blonde hair kissed by sunlight, eyes green as wildfire. He took Sansa's hand and lowered himself to one knee as the hall collectively sighed. Sansa felt the brush of his lips against the back of her hand. His mouth was cool, but his gaze was heated, and there was something coiled within it. Later, she would try to name that look, uncertain if it was predatory or merely proud. In that moment, she forced her lips into the sweet smile she had practiced, the look she had perfected while imagining herself a courtly lady in the tales of gallant knights and noble ladies. Her heart hammered even as she curtsied to him, her head bowed in the graceful acknowledgement of her new prince. What none of the lords and ladies truly knew, what even she barely understood, was that her fate was being sealed that night. This marriage would come sooner rather than later. Indeed, the great September of Baelor would see her cloaked in Baratheon gold and black before the moon turned. She recalled the dreams she'd spun as a little girl, weaving delicate threads of illusions about the perfect prince, handsome, daring, kind. And now she stood before the realm with that dream clutched so close she was half convinced she conjured it, that any moment it might dissolve into smoke. But the truth had talons, and she could feel them at her back, reminding her that Joffrey was not always gentle, not always fair. There was cruelty in him, sly, cunning. Yet he was her betrothed and soon her husband. When the betrothal feast ended and the courtiers had devoured the lavish courses of spiced boar, honey-glazed duck, and thick-sugared pastries, Sansa returned to her chamber. She felt exhaustion settle into her bones, yet she did not immediately undress. Instead, she paced. Her thoughts turned to her father's warning. He had told her that the court was a maze, the Red Keep a labyrinth of secrets where friendships were shaped by ambition. She could see, just at the edges of her mind, the precarious dance of alliances forming. She was a pawn, yes, but a significant one, because she was the key to uniting the North with the crown at a time when rifts threatened to grow. The question was whether she could find her own footing in the swirling currents of King's Landing. The wedding itself happened barely a fortnight later. It was rushed, many whispered, unseemly for a royal wedding to lack the months of preparation typically expected. Grand masques, extravagant feasts, and tournaments were condensed into a single day of festivities. The great September was adorned with golden banners bearing the crowned stag of House Baratheon and those of House Stark in gray and white, a dire wolf loping across a field of ice. Sansa walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Her limbs felt light and quivering, as though she floated on an uncertain tide. The maiden's cloistered statue looked down upon her with carved detachment, as if too merciful to judge, too aloof to offer comfort. Incense curled in the candlelit air. Beneath her silken slippers, the marble floor felt cold. But the eyes of hundreds of lords, knights, and ladies were colder. Her father pressed her hand one last time, a final reassurance, before placing it in the hand of Joffrey Baratheon. She saw Queen Cersei perched to one side, her golden hair in an elaborate arrangement, her lips curled in something that was less than a smile. There was triumph in Cersei's expression. Sansa inhaled, thinking of her own mother. Lady Catelyn had remained in the north with Robb and her younger siblings. Distance from her mother cut deeper on this day than any dream she had once nurtured. But there was no going back. The High Septon murmured his blessings. Under that vaulted dome, Sansa and Joffrey swore their vows, repeating words older than the conquest, with the mother, the father, and all the gods as their witnesses. When Joffrey placed his cloak over her shoulders, she was struck by the weight of it. The Baratheon colors, heavy with gold stitching, nearly overwhelmed her slight frame. She felt as though she had slipped into a new skin, one that proclaimed her no longer a Stark, but a wife, a princess, soon to be queen. Their hands were bound together in silk, and the septon proclaimed them man and wife. Applause thundered and echoed in that ancient space. Sansa barely heard it. Her throat was tight, her eyes fixated on Joffrey's face. He was smiling, a bright and radiant smile, youthful and victorious. Yet in his eyes flickered that green spark of prideful malice. At the lavish feast that followed, Sansa stood by her new husband's side. Cersei insisted she taste the food first, a casual remark about Sansa's wifely duties that made it unclear if she was simply teasing or if the new princess was meant to test for poison. Sansa performed the courtesy nonetheless, forcing sweet wine and roast venison into her mouth without complaint. She tried to mirror Joffrey's posture of confidence, the tilt of his chin, the pleasant distance in his gaze. She concentrated on seeming queenly but felt as helpless as a kitten cornered. When the music played and the dancers filled the floor, Joffrey's hand found hers. He led her forward, thin fingers tight on her own. As they spun in the first dance, she saw the swirl of colors. Red and gold from the Lannisters, black and gold from the Baratheons, and a sprinkling of other houses across the hall. She saw her father, withdrawn at his table, exchanging few words with Lord Renly and others. She saw Peter Baelish leaning in close to whisper something to Lord Varys. She saw the glint in Queen Cersei's eye as she observed them both, hawk-like, and she saw that many were looking upon her with curiosity, as though wondering what manner of woman would share a bed with Joffrey Baratheon. That night, after many toasts and indulgences, Joffrey and Sansa were escorted to the wedding chamber. Despite her dread, her face remained calm. Schooled in the courtesy her septa had drilled into her. The door shut behind them with a resounding thud. Joffrey's eyes gleamed with a flicker of menace. But if there was anything gentle within him, or at least contained, he tried to show it. Awkwardly, he approached her. He seemed uncertain, an inexperienced youth who had memorized masculine arrogance but did not fully grasp its subtleties. Sansa found her voice quavering, yet she spoke softly, "My lord husband." She inclined her head, forcing a small, demure smile. Joffrey did not rush at her with cruelty or lust. Instead, he took her hand, pressed his lips to her wrist. There was excitement in his eyes, something hungry, but he spoke in a tone curiously subdued, as if reciting a line. "We shall do our duty, sweet wife. We shall give the realm an heir." Sansa trembled inwardly. Her mind flickered to everything she had heard about what transpired between a husband and wife, the possibility of it being kind or brutal. In the hush of that night, she tried to be brave. So she reached out, lifted a hand to brush his hair back from his forehead. "Yes," she said, softly as the moon's reflection on water. "We shall do our duty." The weeks that followed were a kaleidoscope of conflicting impressions. To Sansa's surprise, Joffrey did not display open cruelty in their marriage bed, at least not at first. He was proud, and he expected her to pander to that pride, to call him her gallant prince, her strong king-to-be. She found that flattery soothed him like a balm. He would puff up, shoulders thrown back, a smug smile on his face. And in those moments when she showered him with the sweet compliments she had once imagined bestowing on a kind-hearted prince, she realized the power she held. It was a fragile, tremulous thing, but it was there. She began to learn which remarks pleased him, which gestures might guide him. The Red Keep's labyrinth of corridors became her new world. Though it frightened her, she recalled her father's counsel: gather knowledge and allies, be gracious, watchful, and wise. She discovered quickly that court was a snake pit. She had to adapt or be devoured. Joffrey's mother, Queen Cersei, was no friend to Sansa. But she showed an odd form of acceptance, teaching Sansa the proper comportment of a queen, the expected ways she should speak at public events, how to address certain lords by their correct titles. It was less maternal kindness and more a way of molding Sansa into a suitable reflection of her husband's dignity. Cersei did not want a rebellious princess that might shame her precious son, so she extended the barest courtesy. Sansa went along, absorbing every lesson. She took note of Cersei's interactions with Joffrey. The queen could be sharply commanding, but she also coddled him. She praised his every decision, even the unwise ones. Sansa watched the way Joffrey responded, like a child wanting approval. Slowly, Sansa recognized an opportunity. If Joffrey was so eager for praise, perhaps she could harness that desire. Flattery became her weapon of choice. When she used it carefully, he listened to her suggestions. When she pressed too hard, he recoiled like a feral cat. One night, she braved a question. They were in their private solar, where tapestries of hunting scenes adorned the walls and the windows overlooked the Blackwater Bay, shimmering beneath the moon. She asked, in a gentle voice, if he might show more mercy in dealing with the petty criminals brought before him. King Robert was away on a hunt, and Joffrey had been sitting in on petitioners. Joffrey's usual inclination was punishment, sometimes harsh, occasionally theatrical. He turned to her, eyes narrowing. "Why should I show mercy, my lady wife?" he asked, tracing a finger across the golden lion embroidered on his doublet. "They broke the law." Sansa drew closer, resting a hand on his sleeve. "Because, my lord husband, true strength lies in temperance. A wise ruler knows when to show the realm kindness so that the small folk will love you as much as fear you. If they only know fear, one day, if they sense weakness, they might turn against you. But if they love you," she let the words dangle, letting him imagine the adoration he could receive. She saw his expression shift, curiosity and vanity wrestling within. He looked at her as though searching her face for falsehood, and then a small smile curved his lips. "You think they should love me?" She inclined her head. "They must love you and fear you in equal measure. That is how kings are made great, dear husband." He considered her words before nodding curtly. "I will think on it." That was a victory, however small. Sansa smiled to herself that night, a smile tinged with sadness that she needed such cautious manipulations. Yet she felt a spark of hope. If Joffrey could be guided just enough, perhaps her family would benefit. Perhaps Ned Stark might hold more influence at court. Her father, however, seemed troubled. He met her in private when he could, always with a set of guards posted far down the corridor, loyal men from the north, sworn to protect his family. She saw the lines in his face deepen. "Are you well, little one?" he asked her once in a low, urgent voice. She carefully maintained her composure. "Yes, father." She tried a timid smile. "I am learning how to be a princess and in time, a queen." Ned sighed. "I should never have allowed you to marry so young, Sansa. It was rushed." The king insisted. He paused as if he might say more, but then shook his head. "Sometimes we must do our duty. But if ever you need me, you must speak to me. Promise me." She placed a hand on his arm, remembering how large he had always seemed when she was a girl, a tower of quiet strength. "I promise, father." But in her heart, she knew that beyond his good intentions, her father was caught in the relentless churn of royal politics. The king drank himself into stupors more and more often, returning to the Red Keep only to nurse injuries from hunts or quarrel with Cersei. Meanwhile, rumors spread that Robert would name Ned as Hand of the King permanently, though Ned did not desire the role. The Lannisters whispered among themselves and the city swirled with speculation. Was it truly wise to have a Stark so close to power in the capital? Could the Starks outmaneuver the other great houses? Sansa realized how every courtesy she made, every word she spoke in public, shaped perceptions. She also noticed that Joffrey relied on her presence more than he would ever admit. In the days after the wedding, he began to summon her to his side at court, more like an adornment at first, but soon as one who might whisper suggestions in his ear. She understood the precariousness of that role. If she overstepped, she might provoke his anger. But for all his self-assured posturing, Joffrey was at an age where affirmation mattered greatly. The first time she managed to guide him toward leniency in the throne room, she saw the stunned expression on Cersei's face, the slight lift of her brows. The queen covered it swiftly with cool aplomb. Afterward, Cersei cornered Sansa in the corridor, a hand on her arm. "That was a bold suggestion." she said, lips pressed thin. Advising my son to show clemency to a poacher. Sansa remained polite. I spoke only what I felt was best, Your Grace. Joffrey is wise enough to decide for himself. Cersei's green eyes narrowed. Do not forget your place. You are his wife, but he is the heir to the throne. If you try to overshadow him, you will regret it. I would never presume to overshadow him, Sansa murmured, lowering her gaze. I am devoted to his glory. That is what I expected to hear, Cersei said, stepping back with a critical glance. She tossed her hair, letting the gold strands shimmer. See that you continue in that manner. Behind her polite mask, Sansa felt an uneasy twist in her stomach, but she merely curtsied. Yes, Your Grace. Days merged into weeks, weeks into months. Each day, Sansa performed her queenly duties. She sat with Joffrey at feasts and ceremonies, receiving ambassadors from Dorne, welcoming envoys from the Iron Islands. She smiled serenely, making sure to maintain that perfect composure. Occasionally, she noticed a new hardness in Joffrey's voice when he commanded the Kingsguard or gave orders to servants. Yet he seemed keen to show her the best side of himself, if only because he basked in her flattery. By the time rumors of trouble in the Riverlands reached King's Landing, Sansa had grown more adept at reading Joffrey's moods. There were days he showed her the softness of a boy wanting validation. Days he was aloof and cruel with no explanation. She did not yet know how to quell all his darker impulses, but she could sometimes steer him toward more careful decisions. She had done so subtly, praising his foresight, his generosity. The truth was, though, that cruelty still simmered under the surface. She saw it in the way he treated smaller folk, or how he delighted in punishing a fool for a minor mistake. He wanted to appear gallant to her, but the desire to inflict pain remained a spark waiting for kindling. One evening, a terrified serving girl spilled wine on Joffrey's doublet during a banquet. He rose to his feet in a flash of anger, hand raised to strike her. In that moment, Sansa felt her heartbeat slam in her chest. She stood quickly, stepping between them. It was a mere accident, my lord husband, she said in a bright, melodic voice that carried through the hush of the hall. I am certain no harm was meant. The poor girl is trembling from head to toe. The girl knelt, eyes downcast, tears threatening to spill. Joffrey glowered. The tension was thick as a drawn bowstring. Then Sansa placed a gentle hand on Joffrey's forearm, meeting his gaze. Would it not show your magnanimity to spare her? Everyone will speak of your kindness. He hesitated, glancing around the hall, noticing all the eyes upon him. Slowly, he lowered his arm. She is not worthy of punishment, he finally declared, forcing a stiff air of indifference. It was but a stain. The relief in the hall was almost palpable. The serving girl scrambled away, her face stained with gratitude and fear. Sansa exhaled. She knew that, behind closed doors, he might rage at her for intervening. But perhaps she prayed he would remember her support. That night, he said nothing of the incident. He only loomed by the window, gazing out at the flickering lights of the city below, lost in some dark reverie. Sansa did not press him, instead tending to her embroidery by candlelight, waiting for some sign that he might speak. At length, he cleared his throat. You think yourself clever, he said. It was not quite an accusation, more a statement. She lifted her eyes. I only wish to show the realm your generous heart. He sniffed, examining her face. Well, I shall not be made a fool. See that you do not embarrass me like that again, in front of everyone. Her heart pounded, but she kept her composure. I was defending your honor. You think I cannot defend my own honor? His eyes flashed. She dropped her gaze submissively. I would not pee. Resume that, my lord husband. I simply want to help. He said nothing more and withdrew to the bedchamber. Despite the tension, he did not strike her or degrade her. Small blessings, she thought, though it twisted her stomach that these were the terms by which she measured relief. In the coming weeks, a new worry began to loom, the question of children. Whispers circulated among the ladies of the court that a royal heir should come soon. Sansa's every meal was scrutinized. Some older ladies pressed herbal remedies or fertility potions upon her. Queen Cersei would make offhand remarks. A queen is never more secure than when she carries the realm's heir. Sansa forced herself to nod, well aware that her value would increase if she gave Joffrey a child. She was terrified, yet resigned, understanding that if she bore him a son, he might be forced to keep her in a position of relative safety. But no child came in those early moons. Sansa wasn't certain if she was relieved or anxious. Joffrey himself made few remarks about the matter save for when he was riled. Then he would snap, "Where's my heir?" She would bite her lip, murmur about the god's timing. Sometimes she dreaded the idea of binding herself even more permanently to him through a child. And yet she recognized the power in that position. A queen mother might have more sway than a simple consort. She poured her efforts into navigating courtly alliances. She found a quiet ally in Margaery Tyrell, who arrived in King's Landing one bright afternoon as part of a diplomatic visit. Margaery was older, more poised, and Sansa saw in her a reflection of everything a highborn lady of the South was supposed to be: warm smiles, honeyed words, and ability to glean secrets from the faintest slip of the tongue. Margaery offered her small kindnesses, a sympathetic ear, a gift of fresh Dornish lace, a hint of laughter over private jokes. It was not exactly friendship, but it was a step toward forging a bond. Peter Baelish also hovered near. Littlefinger had been a known fixture at court, a master of coin with a perpetual sly smile. He would compliment Sansa on her gown, remark on her growing influence over the prince. "You possess a skill for taming the lion's cub," he joked once. "Though not a lion, truly by rights a stag. But perhaps we shall see if that matters." His words carried an undercurrent of secrets, as though he knew more than he let on. Sansa remained guarded around him. She recalled her mother's warnings that Peter was not to be trusted, that behind his courteous demeanor lay a cunning ambition. Meanwhile, Varys the Spider was equally evasive, always offering cryptic remarks, teasing Sansa with knowledge half-revealed. "The realm is a delicate tapestry, my lady," he once said softly in her presence. "One must be careful not to tug too hard on any single thread or risk unraveling the entire piece." She did not know if he was counseling caution or hinting at potential alliances. But she listened, storing away every tidbit. In the swirling web of intrigues, Sansa clung to the slender thread of her influence over Joffrey. She knew she must protect her father, brothers, and sisters however she could. If Joffrey launched a war against the North or turned on Ned Stark, the consequences would be dire. So she sought to quell his disdain for the North. She praised the stark beauty of Winterfell, the loyalty of its people, the resilience required to endure harsh winters. She appealed to his vanity, suggesting that if he proved his rule reached all corners of the realm, including the far northern strongholds, the bards would sing of his glory. Day by day, Joffrey's hostility toward the North lessened, replaced by a budding curiosity about the wolves that roamed the forests, the watchtowers that dotted the lonely snows. Sometimes he would boast, "When I am king, I shall visit Winterfell, show them what real leadership is." Sansa would smile sweetly and say, "They will love you for it, my king." Her father, hearing these anecdotes, offered a small nod of gratitude, perhaps relieved to see no immediate threat from the crown. Yet the capital seethed with tensions. Robert returned from hunts exhausted and half-drunk, ignoring the cracks forming in his rule. The Lannisters clenched power in one fist, their gold fueling the debts of the kingdom. Rumors came from the east of dragons stirring, but the court dismissed them as nonsense. More pressing were the raids in the Riverlands, said to be carried out by those loyal to Lord Tywin Lannister, or perhaps Gregor Clegane. With each new rumor, Ned Stark's concern deepened, for House Tully was tied to the Starks by blood. Then came the day King Robert died. It happened much as it did in other strands of fate. A hunting accident, a boar's tusk, a wound that turned septic. He was carried back to King's Landing, pale as milk, delirious with fever, cursing the day he had stumbled in that forest. Joffrey was at his bedside, along with Cersei and Ned Stark. Robert attempted to name Ned as Lord Protector until Joffrey came of age, or so Ned claimed, but the letter was seized by Cersei. The city quaked with uncertainty. Sansa stood outside the king's chambers, feeling her chest constrict as the hiss of arguments reached the corridor. Joffrey emerged, eyes wide with shock, and for a moment, he looked more like a frightened boy than a future king. When he caught sight of Sansa, he snapped, "My father is dying. They say he will not last the night." His voice cracked slightly. Sansa searched his face, her own sorrow twisting. Despite everything, King Robert had been her father's friend. He had also been the man who sealed her fate as Joffrey's wife. "I am so sorry," she whispered. His lip curled, but not in anger. "Come," he said, almost pleading. He led her away from the cluster of lords gathered. She followed him into a small alcove. He stood there, fists clenched. "They will all look to me now?" I must be king or they will tear us to pieces. You must stand by me, Sansa. Swear it. I am your wife, she answered simply. I will always stand by you. Joffrey nodded, inhaling sharply. Yes. Good. He swallowed as though trying to bolster his own courage. I will be a great king. You shall see. Robert died before dawn. The castle bells tolled. Sansa was awoken from a restless sleep by a servant's knock, summoning her to the throne room. She found the court assembled, tensions high. Ned Stark stood at one end, flanked by a few loyal guards. Cersei, Joffrey, and a host of Lannister men stood at the other. A hush gripped the hall as Joffrey ascended the Iron Throne, still wearing mourning black. His face looked ashen, but determination glinted in his eyes. A speech was read, proclaiming Joffrey as King of the Undulls and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm. Sansa's knees felt watery, but she sank into a curtsy, her mind swirling. This was the moment. Joffrey was king, and she was his queen consort, though she would not be formally crowned until the grand coronation. She glanced at her father, who wore a grim expression. He stood tall as the king's proclamation concluded. Then the new king demanded pledges of loyalty from the great houses present. Ned, with his jaw set, offered the oath of loyalty on behalf of House Stark. He did so slowly, each word weighed as if it might become a millstone. Sansa saw the flicker of relief in her husband's face at her father's compliance. She prayed that this uneasy balance would hold. But soon came the matter of the royal council. Ned Stark expected to serve as Lord Protector until Joffrey's coronation, according to Robert's final words. Cersei would not have it. She declared Joffrey needed no protector, for he was of age to rule. The lords muttered among themselves. Some looked to Ned for guidance, others to Tywin Lannister's seat. But Tywin was not present. Instead, a letter was read from him giving Joffrey his fealty and pledging Lannister gold to ensure the realm's stability. Sansa stood at Joffrey's side, her heart hammering. She felt certain conflict was coming. Her father insisted that Robert's final words must be honored, that Joffrey would not reach his next name day for months yet. But Cersei refused. Tensions escalated rapidly. Voices rose, swords were drawn. The gold cloaks, sworn to protect the city, initially followed Ned's command until Peter Baelish stepped forward, whispering something to their commander. In a heartbeat, the guards turned, capturing Ned's men. Ned himself was seized. Sansa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She wanted to scream, to beg Joffrey to intervene, to show some measure of mercy, but chaos swallowed the hall. She heard her father shout, "Sansa," as the guards dragged him to the floor. Joffrey remained on the throne, rising to his feet, fury contorting his young face. He demanded silence, demanded that all see him as the rightful king. And as quickly as it began, the brawl ended with Ned Stark in chains. Cersei, triumphant, declared Ned Stark a traitor for defying Joffrey's rule. A stunned hush fell. Joffrey turned to Sansa. He glanced between her and Ned, uncertain, as if searching for a script. Sansa's eyes were wide, tears forming. She started to speak, but Cersei cut her off. "The penalty for treason is death," she said. Lords and ladies gasped. Sansa's mouth went dry. She forced her legs to carry her forward, and she dropped to her knees before the throne. "My Lord King, my husband," she said, voice trembling. "Please grant mercy. He is my father." She turned to face the assembly, searching for even a spark of compassion. Her eyes fell upon Joffrey, beseeching him. "You said a great king shows clemency. Show that greatness now, my king. Spare him and let him take the black, or let him live out his days in the north. I beg you." A heavy silence reigned. Joffrey's lips pressed tight. She could see the war inside him, the desire to flaunt his power, to rid himself of any threat, warring with the memory of her gentle manipulations, her suggestions that mercy might make him beloved. She held her breath, tears sliding down her cheeks unbidden. Then Joffrey's voice cut through the hush. "I am merciful," he said, lifting his chin imperiously. "I grant Ned Stark's life. But he shall lay aside all claim to power here. He shall admit to his treason, and then he shall join the Night's Watch. The realm has no use for him otherwise." Murmurs swept the hall. Ned Stark glared, jaw clenched. Sansa sagged with relief so powerful she nearly fainted. Cersei's expression flickered with disapproval, but she did not openly contradict the king's decree. The guards dragged Ned away to the dungeons. Joffrey turned to Sansa as though expecting her gratitude. She rose, trembling, and offered a shaky smile. Her father's life, at least, was spared for now. It was a reprieve carved out of Joffrey's vanity, a success of her gentle words. But it was still fraught with uncertainty. Her father was captive, forced to pronounce a false confession if he wanted to survive. Sansa's relief was mixed with sorrow. She had saved him from the headsman's axe, but she had also chained him to a lifetime in the Night's Watch. In the days that followed, Sansa stood at Joffrey's side as the city learned of the new king's magnanimous decision. She watched the Lannisters whisper among themselves, some outraged that Joffrey had shown mercy, others relieved to avoid open war with the North. The crown was her husband's now. The question was whether the North would remain loyal or if her brother Robb would march south in anger. She tried to calm Joffrey's moods by reminding him that a peaceful realm would sing his praises. "You have shown the realm your benevolence," she said softly in their private chambers. "Now the North must see that you are just and fair, so they will bend the knee willingly." He paced in front of the brazier, the flames crackling shadows across his face. "If they do not bend, I will bring them to heel." His voice shook with the excitement of conquest, but also a thread of apprehension. "They will bend," she murmured, stepping closer, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You are the king. You have all the strength of the realm at your command." She stroked his ego, the method she had learned, the only approach that diverted his cruelty. "And your mercy has earned you the gratitude of many." He regarded her, eyes narrowed. "You do not want war, do you?" Her pulse fluttered. "I want only what is best for your reign, my king." He studied her a moment more, then exhaled. "Yes, I will be the greatest king the Seven Kingdoms has ever known. You shall see." She nodded, relief coursing through her. In the next breath, however, he drew her close, pressing a kiss to her lips that felt more like a claim than an act of love. She accepted it, stifling the tremor in her limbs. He smelled of scented oils and a hint of steel. His hands were surprisingly cold. But she let him, for this was her role. To be the bridge between the vicious boy king and the rest of the realm, to keep her father alive, to ensure her family might endure whatever storms brewed on the horizon. In the following weeks, Ned Stark gave a public confession under the watchful eye of Lannister guards. He confessed to treason he had not committed, to conspiring against Joffrey's rightful claim, all so that he might take the Black and live. The city gathered to watch, forming a swaying crowd in the scorching sun outside the great September. Sansa stood on a dais, her expression unreadable, her heart pounding in her ears. She saw her father's face, hollow, resigned. When he finished, the hush that followed was suffocating. Joffrey, seated on a temporary throne, rose and proclaimed Ned Stark would be stripped of titles and sent to the wall. Sansa squeezed her eyes shut in relief. A wave of murmurs passed through the throng. Some part of her felt shame that she had aided in this humiliating confession, but at least he would live. She let her gaze fall to the dusty ground, ignoring the shouts of the crowd. Ned was taken north under armed escort, allowed to don the black of the Night's Watch. He would never see Winterfell again, but he was alive and the tenuous peace endured. The reaction in the north was mixed. Robb Stark was outraged, his fury as cold as the winter winds, but for the moment he chose not to raise banners against the crown. The North was not yet ready for open war, not while Ned Stark was living, albeit in exile. The realm soon busied itself with preparations for Joffrey's coronation. Invitations were sent to all the great houses, summoning them to King's Landing for the grand event. Sansa watched as banners arrived, the Tyrell Rose, the Martell Sun, the Falcon of the Vale, the Flayed Man of the Boltons. Most came with carefully crafted smiles, bearing gifts and pleasant words for the new king. Some had ulterior motives, seeking marriage alliances, influence, or recognition. On the day of the coronation, the great September shimmered in gold and sunlight. Joffrey knelt before the High Septon, who placed the crown upon his fair head. Trumpets blared and the crowd cheered, though Sansa thought she heard some forced applause among the throng. She stood at Joffrey's side, dressed in a gown of pale green velvet embroidered with golden thread, signifying her role as queen consort. She was not crowned that day, her separate coronation was to come, but she was recognized as the king's wife, the future queen of the realm. As the doors opened wide, letting in the summer breeze, Sansa studied Joffrey's face. He reveled in the attention, the pomp of the ceremony. He raised his scepter, offering blessings for the realm in a rehearsed speech. His mother looked on, eyes shining with pride. The lords bowed. Sansa forced a dutiful smile, remembering every courtesy expected of her. But beneath that polished veneer, her mind churned. She had to keep him balanced on the razor's edge between vanity and violence. She had to ensure he would not lash out at her family. That evening, the feasting began. Gallons of wine flowed, courses of succulent meats and spiced dishes paraded before them. Mummers performed, jugglers cartwheeled, and singers crooned ballads extolling Joffrey's virtues. His smug laughter echoed in the torchlit hall. Sansa sat at his side, accepting toasts to her beauty and grace. She tasted each dish, careful to leave the best morsels for Joffrey, praising him in small ways. She felt the eyes of the court upon her, analyzing her every gesture. Some suspected her influence, some resented it. When the hall quieted for the final toast, Joffrey stood, surveying the assembled nobles. He raised his goblet, the reflection of candlelight dancing along its rim. "Lords and ladies," he announced, his youthful voice echoing in the hush. "I thank you for your presence, for your loyalty. This realm has suffered the loss of my father, Robert Baratheon, but I vow to honor his memory by bringing an era of peace and prosperity to the Seven Kingdoms. Let my kindness be known, but also my resolve. Any who defy my rule will be shown no mercy." There was a ripple of murmurs. He continued, gesturing toward Sansa. "And here, my beautiful wife, my faithful consort, will stand beside me as we lead the realm to greatness." All eyes turned to Sansa. She inclined her head gently, her cheeks flushed. She despised the center of attention, yet had learned to mask it behind a poised smile. "I am honored, your grace," she said softly. "I shall devote myself to your reign and to the good of all subjects." A smattering of applause followed. Joffrey took his seat, satisfied. The crowd resumed drinking, though pockets of murmured conversation lingered. The feast wound down into a haze of wine, the smell of spilled ale clinging to the air. As the last of the guests stumbled away or were escorted to their chambers, Joffrey and Sansa withdrew to their private apartments. There, behind closed doors, he let out a slow exhale, removing his crown and setting it aside. He seemed weary, as though the day's performance had drained him. Sansa helped him unfasten his cloak, noticing the tension in his shoulders. She kept her voice gentle, not wanting to provoke any latent anger. "You did well, my king," she said, carefully smoothing a hand over his arm. He grunted, sinking into a chair. "They fawn, but I can sense their doubts," he muttered. "They think me too young or too cruel, or that I lack the strength of my father. Fools." He picked at a golden thread on his sleeve. "You will prove them wrong," Sansa said. "You have the power and the intelligence. Soon they will sing of Joffrey the Just or Joffrey the Magnificent." He glanced up, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "Yes, they will," he said, more to reassure himself than anything. He reached for her hand. "And you shall be by my side. You do please me," he added, his manner awkward but genuine in that moment. Sansa swallowed, forcing a small smile. "I am glad, my lord." He leaned closer, pressing a kiss to her cheek that was surprisingly gentle. His breath smelled of wine. She endured it, heart-fluttering. If she could keep him in this state, content, validated, reliant on her praises, perhaps she could steer him away from monstrous acts. Perhaps she could ensure House Stark's survival, protect her father's life in the distant north, and prevent war. Yet she knew how precarious her position was. The crown was a heavy burden on Joffrey's brow, and he was young and untested. If war broke out, or if he felt betrayed, or if the Lannisters pushed him into ruthless displays of power, all her efforts might crumble. The tension in King's Landing was like a tinderbox. One spark could ignite it. Over the next weeks, Sansa saw small signs that her influence held some sway. Joffrey avoided excessive cruelty and public punishments, though his anger occasionally flared in private. She coaxed him to consider new ways to appease the small folk, ordering extra grain stores for the city, for instance, or commissioning new wells in Flea Bottom. Queen Cersei eyed these measures with thinly veiled suspicion, but could not openly oppose them without appearing to undermine the king. In truth, some small portion of the small folk began to speak of Joffrey's mild generosity, not with glowing praise, but with less fear than before. Every success Sansa had was balanced by her constant vigilance. She reminded herself, never offend Cersei, never contradict Joffrey in public, always cloak her advice in compliments to his judgment. It was a dance on a knife's edge. She found an odd mixture of pride and guilt in how adeptly she maneuvered it. She was not the naive girl she had once been. She had grown, forging a new self in the crucible of the Red Keep. Letters from the north were sparse. She learned that Robb had assumed the mantle of Lord of Winterfell, that Bran was still recovering from his accident, that Arya's whereabouts were uncertain. She had vanished somewhere on the road south, last seen heading for the Free Cities, or so rumor said. Sansa's heart ached at the thought of her wild sister, lost to the winds. But she dared not press the matter too strongly. Her mother, Lady Catelyn, remained in the north as well, but wrote occasionally, urging Sansa to stay safe, to be brave, to remember she was a Stark. Sansa read those letters in solitude, tears slipping down her cheeks. She could not share her mother's words with Joffrey. She kept them locked away as a secret vow to herself. In every letter, her mother ended with, "The North remembers." Sansa tried to hold those words close, uncertain what they might mean for the future. As the months rolled on, Joffrey continued to solidify his reign. The realm settled into an uneasy peace, with fewer bandit raids and no open rebellions. The Lannisters maintained control over the royal purse, strengthening alliances with powerful lords through marriages and promises of wealth. Sansa made sure to encourage Joffrey to show small kindnesses, to meet with the realm's knights and reward them for loyalty. There were times he balked, complaining it was tedious, but he relented under her gentle persuasion. Her father's situation weighed on her. She wrote to him at the Wall, telling him of the calmer politics in King's Landing. He wrote back stiffly, urging her to stay true to herself, to remember that a gentle heart could guide men to better ends. She read those words over and over, tears pricking her eyes. Perhaps even in the frozen wasteland of the North, Ned Stark knew she had become Joffrey's anchor. Yet nightmares haunted her sleep. She often saw scenes of her father on the executioner's block, or glimpses of Joffrey's cruelty unleashed, or the Red Keep in flames. She would jolt awake, the thin shift clinging to her sweating skin. In those moments, she would sit by the window, gazing at the distant lights of King's Landing, a city so full of dangers and secrets. She had come so far from that girl who dreamed of a storybook prince. She had learned to don a queen's mask and whisper the right words to a volatile boy king. One morning, she discovered an unexpected solace. While walking in the gardens, she encountered Margaery Tyrell again. The Tyrell maiden had returned for further talks at court. They strolled together amid rose bushes, exchanging empty pleasantries at first. Then Margaery gently squeezed Sansa's hand. "I see you are well, my friend," she said quietly, "and I am glad for it. Some had feared your marriage to the king would be difficult." Sansa lowered her gaze. "I manage." Margaery nodded, her brown eyes reflecting a spark of understanding. She inclined her head, voice lowered. "If you should ever need an ear or a confidant, I hope you will come to me. You mustn't feel alone." A tremor of gratitude stirred in Sansa's chest. She murmured her thanks, careful not to reveal too much. After all, the walls had ears, the courtyards had eyes, and the Red Keep's secrets had a way of finding their way to the wrong tongues. But Margaery's gentle concern gave her a faint sense of companionship she had sorely lacked. Back in her chambers, Sansa confronted her reflection in the mirror, adjusting the gold circlet that marked her as the king's consort. She was taller now, her figure more womanly, her eyes carrying a subtle wariness. The Stark sigil was rarely displayed on her person, replaced by the crowned stag, but she could never cast aside her true origins. She had become adept at the cunning courtesies of King's Landing, but she still felt the pull of the North in her blood. Joffrey, for his part, was enthralled by the adulation surrounding him. He liked hearing that the populace called him merciful, though the word often came from those threatened or bribed by Lannister gold. He liked seeing the lords jockey for favor, and he liked leaning on Sansa's arm in public, because it made him appear gallant. One afternoon, in the Red Keep's training yard, he decided to display his skill at arms. He summoned Sansa to watch, as if seeking her approval. He demanded a spar with the Kingsguard 3 at once. Ser Meryn and Ser Boros complied, though they obviously held back. Joffrey fought with a showy flourish, the sun glinting off his breastplate. He landed a few decent strikes, but Sansa suspected the knights let him. When he disarmed one of them, Joffrey glanced at Sansa, beaming. She clapped politely, a small smile on her lips. Then, at the end of the spar, a stable boy accidentally released a frightened mare into the yard. The horse galloped frantically, nearly barreling into Joffrey. Enraged, the king turned on the boy, shouting curses. For a heart-stopping moment, Sansa feared he would draw his sword and run the boy through. She stepped forward swiftly. "My lord, your skill is unmatched," she said loudly, catching his arm. "That horse could not harm you, for you are the bravest knight in the realm." Her voice rang across the yard, ensuring the onlookers heard her. She saw the boy kneeling, shivering, tears in his eyes. Joffrey looked ready to strike him, but paused when the crowd's gaze fell upon him. He let out a short laugh, throwing his sword to the ground. "Of course," he said. "A dumb beast is no match for me." He turned to the boy. "See to it this never happens again." The boy scrambled away, murmuring apologies. Sansa exhaled, feeling the tension leaving her shoulders. She sensed all the eyes around them. So many watchers would see the king's near act of violence as a moment of short temper. She tried to smooth it over with a soft laugh, gently praising his victory in the spar. Joffrey basked in it, forgetting his anger, but she knew how close they had come to bloodshed. In the days that followed, she continued her subtle campaign to tame his cruelty. She planted suggestions about how a king's reputation was built on wise counsel and measured actions, not raw brutality. She reminded him of the men who had served his father, the loyalty they bore. She invoked the stories of ancient kings, both merciful and terrible. Each anecdote was carefully chosen. Slowly, she observed slight improvements. He lost his temper less frequently, though the underlying malice still lurked. The Lannisters seemed divided on whether this was to their advantage. Cersei wanted power through her son, but also recognized that an overly cruel king might spark rebellions. She watched Sansa with cautious approval, occasionally offering faint praise. "You've done well to keep the king settled," she remarked once, though her tone was laced with warning. "But be mindful, girl. No one rules Joffrey but Joffrey." Sansa bowed her head. "Of course, your grace." Then, shockingly, word reached King's Landing that her mother, Lady Catelyn, had ventured to the Riverlands and successfully brokered a truce with Walder Frey for better passage across the Twins. Rumors swirled that Robb might mobilize some forces not to attack the crown directly, but to assert the North's autonomy in certain dealings. Sansa's breath caught. If war flared, all her careful balancing might be undone. She wondered if her father's safe captivity at the Wall was enough to keep tensions from boiling over. She found Joffrey sitting on the Iron Throne one morning, bored as a cat in the sun, hearing petitions from minor lords. She gathered her courage. As she approached, she curtsied, ignoring the golden plates of the throne that jutted out menacingly. "My king," she said, voice carrying in the vaulted hall. "May I speak?" He waved a hand. "Yes, my lady queen." He seemed amused. "What do you wish?" She swallowed, her eyes flicking over the assembled courtiers. "I have heard stirring reports from the Riverlands. Perhaps it is wise to extend an offer of peaceful negotiation, if only to show we value stability in all parts of the realm." She paused, carefully continuing, "You have displayed mercy before, my king, sparing my lord father. Such reason could inspire the lords of the Riverlands to remain loyal without further strife." He leaned forward, interest piqued. "Do you fear war?" She kept her voice steady, her eyes on his. "I fear the harm it would bring to your subjects, the cost in blood and gold. A wise king knows when to parley, just as he knows when to take up arms." The hall murmured softly. Some of the courtiers shifted uneasily. Sansa braced herself, wondering if she had overstepped. Joffrey's gaze flickered to Cersei, who sat to the side. The queen's expression was unreadable, but she offered the faintest nod. Joffrey returned his attention to Sansa. "Very well. I shall send envoys," he declared, somewhat pompously. "But if they defy my rightful rule, I will crush them." A wave of relief coursed through Sansa. She bowed. "Thank you, my king." Outside the throne room, she let out a long breath. Already, she sensed the game was shifting. If Robb did anything rash, Joffrey's fragile display of mercy could crumble. If the Lannisters provoked violence, the North might rise. She lived in constant fear of the fragile veneer snapping. Yet for now, Joffrey had chosen a more measured path, a path she had offered him. That night, she found herself walking the corridors, restless. She paused by a window, staring out at the moonlit city. The wind carried the distant roar of the sea. She thought of Winterfell, of the Godwood, and the quiet hush of snow. She remembered simpler dreams, the illusions of a perfect prince and a shining crown. Now, she was a queen in all but title, forging alliances and managing the king's temper like a caretaker with a dangerous beast. She wondered if any of this was truly worth it. Yet the memory of her father's life spared, of her house still standing, gave her resolve. She might be living in a den of lions, but she had learned how to muzzle the lion cub turned king. In the morning, a cool dawn light spread across the city. Sansa awoke next to Joffrey, who stirred lazily. She rose and dressed, the routine now second nature. When she emerged into the solar, she found him reading a scroll, a faint frown on his face. He looked up at her. Important news, my king? He hesitated. A letter from Tywin. He suggests we move more forces west to bolster the border with the Riverlands. He says the boy in the north, your brother, might grow bold. He tossed the parchment onto a table. My grandfather wants war. Or at least to intimidate the Tullis and Freys. But you counsel peace. His gaze bored into her, accusation glinting there. Sansa's mouth felt dry. I counsel what I believe is best for the realm. He rose abruptly, stepping toward her. Am I not what's best for the realm? She forced herself to remain calm, to recall that her father's life hung on her ability to soothe this monster child. Of course. None are more fitted to reign than you, my king. But you also wish to be remembered as the king who kept the realm united. Do you not? His anger softened slightly. Yes. Yes, I do. She laid a hand on his shoulder, gazing up at him with an earnest expression. Then listen to your heart and to the counsel that serves your legacy, not just your grandfather's ambition. If war becomes inevitable, you will fight as a king must, but until that day, you show your strength through restraint. He exhaled, eyes scanning her face. You were wise for a girl from the north. Her heart fluttered, relief mixing with a subtle ache of sadness. I am only as wise as my king allows me to be, she said softly, lowering her gaze. He tilted her chin up, a rare gentle gesture. Then I shall allow it, he said, a little smirk on his lips. For now. Thus, another crisis was averted. The Lannister forces remained in check, though tension between the West and the Riverlands simmered like a pot nearing boil. Robb Stark, hearing that Ned Stark yet lived at the Wall and that Sansa's influence seemed to keep Joffrey's worst impulses at bay, hesitated to commit to war. Catelyn Tully likewise worked for compromise, though how long that might hold was uncertain. Months blended into a year. Through careful words and measured affection, Sansa maintained her hold on Joffrey's favor. She endured nights when he was cold or angry, placating him with promises of the future. She accepted his kisses, his touch, sometimes even glimpses of genuine admiration. He showed her off at feasts, and she indulged his vanity by praising his judgment. Piece by piece, the realm stabilized under the boy king who claimed Robert's legacy. Whispers circulated that the queen consort was forging a gentler hand upon him, though none dared say it too loudly. In time, the news of her first pregnancy arrived, a subtle sign from the gods, or perhaps merely luck. She felt the stirrings in her body, the changes that signaled new life. She confided in Maester Pycelle, who solemnly confirmed it. When she told Joffrey, he was startled, then triumphant. He boasted of his heir to the court, calling for a special feast to celebrate. Queen Cersei feigned graciousness, though Sansa could sense her jealousy at no longer being the primary guiding force in Joffrey's life. Still, the realm took the news of a royal heir as a sign of continued stability. The lords spoke in murmurs of a new era, with House Baratheon's line secured. Sansa, smiling serenely, realized that with a child, her position might solidify. Her father's line would have a claim to the throne through her child, bridging House Stark and the crown. Perhaps in the future, there could be genuine peace. She prayed each night before the old gods and the new, praying for a safe birth, for the child to bring out the best in Joffrey, for the fragile peace she had built not to be torn asunder. She was no longer the innocent girl who had first come to King's Landing, starry-eyed with dreams of a perfect prince. She was a queen consort who had learned to placate a cruel boy king and guide him, step by step, toward decisions that might benefit the realm. She had paid a price in innocence, in illusions. But she had grown, forging her will like steel in the face of danger. And for now, that steel had tamed the cruelty within Joffrey Baratheon, if only barely, if only by appealing to his pride. Through cunning and care, Sansa Stark had found a way to survive and shape the narrative of the Seven Kingdoms. She gazed out from the Red Keep's battlements as the sun set over Blackwater Bay, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, and she felt an uneasy stirring of hope. Their story was far from over, but this chapter belonged to her. The chapter where the quiet daughter of the North learned to tame a king. And in that delicate balance, there lay the seeds of peace, or the seeds of a greater conflict yet to bloom. For the moment, though, she stood with the breeze lifting her auburn hair, a light hand resting on her barely rounded belly, and resolved to hold on to her hard-won influence. She was both a Stark of Winterfell and a queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and she would do whatever it took to keep her family safe, to maintain peace, and to ensure that this path she had carved in blood and tears did not collapse. Even if it meant whispering sweet words to a king with cruelty etched in his bones, she would continue, because she was Sansa Stark and the North remembered. And she, in turn, had learned how to make the South bend to her will, one gentle, measured step at a time. Sansa Stark felt the stir of morning light through the slender windows, the faint pink glow illuminating the high ceiling of her bedchamber in the Red Keep. She lay awake, one hand pressed gently to the small but perceptible swell of her belly, thinking of how strange her life had become. Once, she had been the young daughter of Winterfell, a girl who dreamed of gallant princes and heroic deeds. Now, a year and more after her wedding, she was queen consort of the Seven Kingdoms. If not yet crowned, then effectively so in all but ceremony. Her every step, every word, seemed carefully observed and weighed by the courtiers around her. And yet, she had gained influence in ways she could never have imagined. She turned on her side and looked at the sleeping figure of her husband, Joffrey Baratheon, King Joffrey, who had ascended the Iron Throne after Robert Baratheon's fatal hunting accident. Joffrey's face appeared deceptively innocent in repose, the angles of his cheeks softened by youth. But Sansa knew how swiftly that softness could twist into cruelty. She had witnessed it on the training grounds, in the throne room, during feasts, flashes of anger, a vicious streak that once threatened to devour them both. She remembered how he had very nearly had her father executed in front of the Great September. She still trembled to think how close they had come to that horror, her father's head on a spike, if not for the intervention she and her sweet words had managed. Instead, Ned Stark lived in the far north, clad in black at the wall, exiled for crimes he never committed. When Joffrey stirred, blinking away the vestiges of sleep, Sansa schooled her features into a serene expression. She took a calming breath. He had been easier to soothe recently, her pregnancy delighted him, offering proof of his potency and a promise of an heir for the realm. Sometimes, when he was in a decent mood, he would place a hand on her abdomen as if imagining the crown his child would one day wear. In those moments, she had glimpsed in him an awkward tenderness, the flicker of a boy who wanted love. But always, she reminded herself that she must tread carefully, for his temper was never far. "Good morning," she said softly, shifting to face him, her auburn hair falling across her shoulders. He sat up, running a hand through his golden curls, eyes lingering on her face. "Good morning," he replied, voice heavy from sleep. He glanced at the circlet of gold resting on a nearby table, his smaller crown, the one he wore daily. "I dreamt of victory," he said, a faint curve to his lips. "I stood on the battlements of Harrenhal, lords from all the kingdoms kneeling to me." Sansa offered a mild smile. "A fitting dream for a king." He seemed satisfied, but after a pause, his brows furrowed. "We have more envoys to receive today, do we not?" "We do," she confirmed. She gently pushed herself up, trying not to let her slight discomfort show. The maids insisted the child was healthy, that her body was changing, but she felt every small ache as she rose. The Martell party arrived last night, seeking further negotiations about trade routes. And there is a letter from your grandfather requesting an audience, or so I believe. No doubt he has counsel for you regarding the Riverlands. Joffrey set his jaw. Lord Tywin always has counsel. He wants me to move soldiers to threaten the Tullus. But if I do so too aggressively, the North might rise, and that fool boy Robb Stark might fancy himself another king in the North. He shot a glance at Sansa as though expecting her to take offense. She forced a composed smile. "Robb is not a fool, my king. He holds the loyalty of the North, true, but he desires peace so long as our father remains alive. As I have told you, they only wish not to be threatened." Inwardly, she reflected that her brother had grown from a quiet youth to the Lord of Winterfell in the absence of their father. But if Robb had any ambition to break away from the Iron Throne, he had kept that ambition contained. He certainly had not crowned himself king in the North as he might have done if Ned Stark had been executed. That knowledge was Sansa's small relief. Joffrey narrowed his eyes, but something in his expression shifted as if recalling all the times her counsel had proven beneficial. "Yes," he muttered, "and we have no immediate reason to push them. If they remain quiet, then the North can do as it pleases, so long as it bends the knee." He slid out of bed, shoulders tensing for a moment. "I'm hungry. Come join me for breakfast. Then we can deal with the rest." She managed a slight smile. "As my king commands." Together, they dressed with the assistance of servants. Joffrey donned a tunic of fine black velvet trimmed in Lannister crimson, for he favored gold and red these days, despite the Baratheon black and gold being his official house colors. Sansa wore a flowing gown of dove gray with delicate embroidery of tiny stags at the hem. An acknowledgement of her position as a Baratheon consort, even if her heart still quietly beat for the North. She allowed a maid to weave her hair back with silver ribbons. Every adornment had its message at court. Down in the dining solar, they broke their fast with fresh bread, eggs, and cups of watered wine. The conversation was largely about petty matters. A minor scuffle in Flea Bottom, rumors of a foreign envoy from the Free Cities, and the whisper that Stannis Baratheon, Robert's stern brother, was sending ravens demanding that the royal court confirm his position on Dragonstone. Joffrey made a face at the mention of Stannis. He skulks on his miserable island, proclaiming himself the rightful heir. But the throne is mine by father's decree. Stannis can fume all he wants. He has no support. Sansa inclined her head, trying not to show her nerves. If Ned Stark's suspicions about Joffrey's true parentage ever spread, if the realm widely believed Joffrey to be a child of incest, not truly Robert's son, Stannis would have a powerful claim. But Sansa had no wish to see that truth surface. That would unleash destruction on them all, especially her father at the Wall and her family in the north. So she merely said, "As you say, my king." When they finished, Joffrey left to convene with the small council. Sansa followed, as was her custom. She had managed, surprisingly, to attend more of these meetings than a typical consort might, mostly by softly insisting that her perspective could be useful. The memory of how she once kept him calm in the throne room, or how she averted the bloodshed that might have come from foolish decisions, lingered in Joffrey's mind. He had come to rely on her presence, if only for the flattery and subtle direction she offered. They entered the council chamber, a long, high-ceilinged room with a window overlooking Blackwater Bay. Around the table were arrayed various figures of power and cunning. Grand Maester Pycelle hovered at one end, rotund and wheezing. Peter Baelish Littlefinger sat with a smug twist to his lips. Varys, the master of whispers, sat quietly, hands folded, observing everything. And on a newer seat, given as a courtesy, was Margaery Tyrell, who had arrived in King's Landing again to represent the interests of Highgarden in her family's stead. Queen Cersei was late to the council this morning, which was not unusual if she had spent the previous night in private meetings with her brother, Jaime, or her father's envoys. Joffrey took his chair at the head of the table, Sansa at his right. Varys inclined his head in greeting. "Your Grace, my Lady Queen." His voice was silken, unctuous. Peter slid his cool gaze from Joffrey to Sansa and back. "We were discussing, Your Grace, the matter of the crown's finances." Joffrey waved a dismissive hand. "Boring," he said. "It's always gold, gold, gold with you, Littlefinger. We have enough to feed the city, do we not?" Sansa caught Peter's wry smile. He leaned forward. "For the moment, yes, thanks to certain lucrative sources of coin." He tapped the table with a ringed finger. "But if we aim to avoid levying new taxes on the small folk, we need to keep the Tyrell alliance warm. They have the harvest of the Reach, after all." Margaery Tyrell, elegant in a gown of pale blue, inclined her head. "House Tyrell stands ready to aid the king," she said softly, smiling at Joffrey. "We only wish to see the realm prosperous. My Lord Father, Mace Tyrell, sends his best regards and extends the invitation once again for you to visit Highgarden and see the wealth of our fields." Joffrey pursed his lips. "Perhaps in time. For now, the city is my focus." From beneath lowered lashes, Sansa observed Margaery. The young woman's manners were exquisite, her bearing regal. She often wondered if Margaery would have been Joffrey's bride in a different path of fate. After all, that was the alliance that, in the original swirl of rumors, the Lannisters would have sought. But events had gone differently, and now Margaery seemed content to remain at court, forging a close bond with Sansa. Sansa found in her a gentle ally, if not a friend she could fully trust. No one at court could be truly trusted. Cersei swept into the room, flanked by 2 guards. Her emerald eyes flicked across the table, narrowing slightly at the sight of Margaery, who rose politely in greeting. "Forgive my tardiness," Cersei said, tone cool. She took a seat near Joffrey, across from Sansa, the sleek arrangement of her golden hair framing a proud face. "What new troubles plague us today?" Littlefinger cleared his throat. "Merely the usual demands of the realm, Your Grace. The Dornish envoys request more favorable trade tariffs, the Tyrells desire, and Lord Tywin demands a show of force in the Riverlands." Joffrey cut in, hands braced on the arms of his chair, which might or might not be wise. Cersei's gaze flicked to him, unreadable. My father believes it important for the crown to assert its authority. Without a strong presence, the blackfish in Riverrun may well stir trouble again. And the Tullus. She cast a glance at Sansa, a faintly mocking expression. Well, they are kin to your mother, are they not? Sansa kept her face neutral. They are, she answered softly, and they have thus far kept the peace since my father's punishment. Lord Edmure Tully would not provoke the Iron Throne without cause. Cersei's lips curved in a slight sneer. Without cause? Let us hope so. She turned to Joffrey. Still, your grandfather believes that a modest increase in the number of soldiers posted in the region might quell any restless impulses. Joffrey paused, glancing at Sansa. She saw the flicker in his eyes. He was weighing whether to heed Tywin or to adopt Sansa's softer approach. She offered the faintest nod, encouraging him to compromise if possible. Very well, Joffrey declared. Increase the garrison along the borders, but do not provoke a fight. Station them under someone loyal. The realm is not in need of another war. He scowled as he said it, as though part of him longed for the glory of battle, but he had heard Sansa's caution enough times. Any further matters? Varys lifted his hands in a conciliatory gesture. A small matter. Rumors drift in from the narrow sea of Daenerys Targaryen. They say she travels with dragons. A hush fell. Cersei's eyes flashed. Peter Baelish let out a short laugh. Children's tales, he said dismissively. If the Targaryen girl had dragons, we would have seen them by now, yes? The Master of Whisperers tilted his head. Perhaps. I only caution that rumors have a way of growing teeth. Joffrey snorted. Should the girl dare set foot on Westerosi shores, we shall feed her and her pets to the Lannister archers. He smirked, but Sansa sensed the worry behind the swagger. Tales of dragons always stirred ancient fears. The realm had not forgotten Aegon's conquest. They concluded the meeting with a smattering of additional details: tax laws, improvements to the city's wells, the scheduling of small council gatherings. As they rose from the table, Joffrey grabbed a handful of sweetmeats from a platter and popped one in his mouth. I'm off to speak with the Kingsguard, he announced. Ser Meryn has been lazy of late, and I'd have him drilled properly. Sansa curtsied. I wish you success, my king. He smirked, and she sensed that he enjoyed the sound of her deference. Yes, yes, he muttered before striding out. Flanked by Lannister guards, Margaery drew closer to Sansa as they left the chamber, hooking her arm through hers with a gesture that was both intimate and decorous. You look pale, my lady, she said gently. Shall we walk in the gardens? The morning air might refresh you. Sansa considered the watchful eyes around them, Cersei's in particular. But Cersei seemed more interested in conferring with Baelish. Sansa allowed herself a private moment with Margaery, hoping it might give her a little solace. That would be lovely. They made their way along a corridor, descending a flight of steps that led to the royal gardens. Lemon trees and towering hedges provided dappled shade from the strengthening sun. A few guards hovered at a respectful distance, letting the ladies stroll at leisure. Sansa took a steadying breath, inhaling the fragrance of blossoming flowers. For all King's Landing squalor, the gardens at the Red Keep could sometimes remind her of the Godwood back home, though warmer, more vibrant with southern scents. How fare you, truly? Margaery asked quietly, guiding her to a stone bench near a small fountain. You are with child, and your face is drawn. Sansa clasped her hands over her belly. She felt the gentle swell beneath her palms, a life that might one day rule the realm. The thought both comforted and frightened her. I am well enough, she whispered. Just tired. The demands of the court weigh on me. It was not a lie, but neither was it the full truth. Margaery smiled, sympathy in her dark eyes. I can only imagine. King Joffrey must rely on you for many things. Sansa dipped her head. He does. Perhaps more than he knows. But she caught herself glancing at the guard stationed behind a hedge within earshot if they cared to listen. She lowered her voice further. I find ways to manage. A gentle breeze stirred Margaery's hair. Should you need help, she let the words hang, intangible but sincere. Sansa studied her companion's face. Margaery Tyrell was adept at the game of court. She was known for kindness, for forging alliances, for winning hearts. Yet Sansa could not forget that the Tyrells had their own ambitions. She might be a potential ally, but only as far as it benefited House Tyrell's influence at court. Still, there was something in Margaery's manner that made Sansa believe she would not betray her lightly. "Thank you," Sansa murmured. "You have been a friend to me." Margaery's hand squeezed hers. "As best as one can be in this place." A flicker of sadness passed over her face. "I've heard from my brother Loras that war could still come, if the North or the Riverlands believe the Crown intends to crush them. The Tyrells want peace above all else. War disrupts harvests, trade, everything. I admire that you have helped keep King Joffrey's temper in check." Sansa felt a swell of conflicting emotions. Pride that she had managed to quell the worst of Joffrey's cruelty, shame that she was forced to do so by flattering him, and fear that it might all be undone by a single provocation. She pressed her lips together. "I do what I must." They sat in silence for a moment, the fountain's trickle soothing, the sun warm on the back of Sansa's neck. Beyond the walls of the Red Keep, the city teemed with life. Sellers hawking wares, whores calling from brothels, children running barefoot on cobbles. Somewhere out there, her sister Arya might be wandering. Letters from her mother had contained no hint that Arya had been found. Rumors claimed the girl had fled across the narrow sea or joined a caravan heading north. Sansa felt that old ache, longing for her family to be whole again. But at least her father was alive, a man in black up on the wall. She clung to that victory. She had saved him from the headsman's sword, even if it cost him Winterfell. And if her unborn child could keep Joffrey's anger subdued, perhaps the realm might avoid a war that would tear the Starks and Tullis apart. When she parted ways with Margaery, she made her way to a small sept within the Red Keep. Though she was not as devout as some at court, she found solace in the cool hush, the incense drifting in pale ribbons. She knelt before the altar of the Mother, pressing her hands together. Quietly, she prayed for the strength to endure, for the child to come safely, for the realm to remain at peace. She prayed too for the old gods, in her heart. Though there was no heart tree here, she remembered the ancient face carved in the godswood of Winterfell, and in her mind, she whispered a plea. "Let me protect my family. Let me find a path through this labyrinth of lies." The next days passed in a blur of small matters. Sansa accompanied Joffrey to audiences in the throne room, where minor lords presented grievances, complaints about tax burdens, disputes over farmland. Joffrey disliked such trivialities, often urging them to speak quickly. Sansa would sometimes lean in, murmuring a suggestion that he either bestow a small concession or refer them to a lesser functionary. Repeatedly, she watched him fight down the impulse to punish them for the slightest insolence. More than once, he seemed on the verge of ordering a beating or demanding a tribute from the unfortunate petitioners. But her presence, her soft voice, her well-placed compliments guided him away from extremes. And all the while, the kingdom waited for news from the Riverlands. Tywin Lannister wrote letters urging a show of force. Catelyn Tully, in the north, wrote to Sansa personally, entreating her daughter to keep the realm from descending into bloodshed. Sansa read these letters in private, tears stinging her eyes, as she saw her mother's fear and worry etched in every stroke of ink. Catelyn ended all her missives with "The North remembers," a reminder that House Stark's heritage and pride still ran deep. Nights brought her little peace. Sometimes she woke to find Joffrey's side of the bed empty, only to discover he had gone to prowl the corridors or torment a fool for his late-night amusement. Other times, he would return from such outings smug, as if thirsting for praise. She learned to greet him with carefully crafted words. "You are so vigilant, my king," or "You see all that happens in your realm," just enough to keep him from turning on her. Beneath that, her nerves were wound tight, afraid that if she said the wrong thing, he might lash out at her as he had done to others in the past. But for the most part, he refrained from violence toward her, enthralled by the idea that she was bearing his child, fueling his fantasies of a royal lineage. When the pregnancy became more visible, she shifted from wearing fitted bodices to looser gowns that draped around her middle. The court took note, congratulating her in simpering tones as though the child was half theirs. More than once, courtiers approached her, offering small gifts or omens of good fortune. Sansa accepted them all with a gentle smile, well aware these gifts were veiled bribes for royal favor. The ladies fussed around her, praising her glow and speculating on whether the child would be a boy or a girl. Queen Cersei observed from a distance, her expression betraying pride in the continuation of House Baratheon, though Sansa knew the truth of those bloodlines better than anyone and faint displeasure that another woman now commanded the king's attention. Yet Cersei never openly attacked Sansa, for she recognized that the unborn heir was precious to the stability of Joffrey's reign. In time, the tension between them settled into a wary civility. They had no love for each other, but they had a shared interest in preserving Joffrey's throne. One afternoon, as Sansa rested in her solar, she received a visitor she had not anticipated, Ser Jaime Lannister. The Kingslayer had returned from a brief mission, though the rumors about what exactly he had been doing were vague. He strolled in without ceremony, the soft clink of his armor echoing in the corridor behind him. Sansa stood, smoothing the folds of her gown, feeling a slight twinge in her back from the pregnancy. She courtesied politely, for despite everything, he was brother to the queen. "Your Grace," Jaime said, offering a small bow, though his tone was flippant. "Might we speak privately?" Her pulse quickened, uncertain of his motives. Jaime Lannister was dangerous. Skilled in swordplay, sharp of tongue, rumored to be far closer to Cersei than any brother should be. But refusing him outright might cause friction. She glanced at her handmaid, then gave a nod. "Leave us," she instructed the girl. When they were alone, Sansa watched as Jaime took a few steps around the solar, as though appraising the tapestries. He seemed entirely at ease, in that careless, arrogant manner that marked him as a Lannister. Eventually, he spoke. "You're bigger than I recall," he said with a faint smirk, glancing at her middle. She forced a mild smile, ignoring the slight insult in his comment. "Pregnancy does that to a woman, Ser." "Ah, indeed." His eyes narrowed. "We Lannisters are a family that values power, but rarely have we found ourselves beholden to a Stark for that power. You are the king's wife, after all, and the mother of his heir-to-be." She said nothing, waiting for the point of his remark. He gave a soft chuckle. "Cersei might not say it, but she sees the effect you have on Joffrey. Better than any of us, you can stay his hand when he's about to do something foolish." He tilted his head. "I came to see it for myself." Sansa's heart thudded, but she kept her voice steady. "And have you?" Jaime studied her, arms folded, the sun catching the gilded sheen of his armor. "Yes, I see a quiet northern girl who's learned to wear a careful mask. One wonders what she truly thinks of all this." She drew a soft breath. "I think only of doing my duty, to my husband, to the realm." He barked a laugh, though not unkindly. "I'll not pry further, my lady. Only know that if you continue to keep Joffrey from causing a war, you'll be doing House Lannister as great a service as House Stark." He paused, gaze cool. "But if you fail, I doubt I need to describe what might happen to you." A chill prickled along Sansa's skin. She forced herself to remain composed. "War benefits no one," she said softly. "We have lost enough to it already." "Jaime, no. Deaded once." "Indeed, so keep him pacified if you can." With that, he turned and strode out, leaving her to exhale a shaking breath in the hush of the solar. She sank onto a cushioned seat, pressing a hand to her abdomen. Her heart still hammered. Jaime's words were both a reminder of her fragile position and an odd form of backhanded encouragement. She had become indispensable to the Lannisters, ironically enough. For as long as Joffrey valued her counsel and carried some semblance of a gentle side toward her, she could maneuver to maintain peace and keep House Stark from destruction. Time passed, and Sansa found herself further into her pregnancy, well over 6 moons, judging by Pycelle's count. She had grown used to the subtle aches and the extra weight. Her ankles sometimes swelled, and the heat of King's Landing grew oppressive, but she soldiered through, maintaining a calm facade. One late afternoon, she wandered to the castle ramparts for fresh air, leaning on the stone parapet as a gentle breeze lifted her hair. The bay spread out below, ships dotting the horizon. In the courtyard behind her, the clang of steel on steel rang out. Joffrey practicing with the Kingsguard, no doubt. She closed her eyes, letting the wind soothe her. A moment later, footsteps approached. She glanced over her shoulder to see Petyr Baelish, clad in his usual elegant attire, a mockingbird pin at his collar. He offered a smooth smile. "My lady queen, it is a delight to find you alone." Sansa tensed. Littlefinger unsettled her more than most at court. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of fascination and cunning, that put her on edge. She had not forgotten her mother's warnings that Petyr Baelish was not to be trusted, and she often recalled the way he had turned on Ned Stark, siding with the Lannisters when it mattered most. Yet, he had a knack for appearing helpful when it served him. "Lord Baelish," she said politely, offering a slight bow of her head. She did not move from the parapet. "Are you in need of something?" He smiled, leaning on the stone beside her, looking out over the city. "Is it not enough to enjoy the evening air with a friend?" She resisted the urge to scoff. "We are not exactly friends, my lord." His eyes crinkled with amusement. "Ever so honest, dear Sansa. I suppose you have reason to be cautious. But let me say how impressed I am. Taming the king with such grace, ensuring your father's life, skillfully forging alliances. Why, you might be the cleverest Stark that Winterfell ever produced." Her stomach twisted. She glanced around to see if any guards were near. 2 were posted at a distance, but likely out of earshot. "I do only what I must for my family," she said quietly. Yes." He shifted his weight, tapping a finger on the parapet. "Have you considered what will happen when your child is born? Cersei will try to mold that child as she molded her own. Tywin may seek to use it as a bargaining chip. You, dear Sansa, may find yourself overshadowed by the next generation of Lannisters." "Baratheons," she corrected, though the irony made her stomach churn. "My child will bear the stag and claim the throne." A knowing gleam lit his eyes. "Yes, of course, the stag. Or perhaps the lion beneath it. Either way, House Stark's sigil fades to the background. Does it not?" She swallowed. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the game never ends," he said softly, glancing over the rooftops of the city. "You have been clever enough to survive thus far, but you must think further ahead. The day may come when you want your family's interests to be more than mere survival. And when that day comes, you might need an ally with resources." She stared at him. "You would offer yourself?" He inclined his head. "I always had a fondness for your mother's family." That faint smirk brushed his lips. "If you ever find that you need my aid, you know where to find me." Let us not pretend we trust one another, but sometimes trust is not required, only mutual advantage. Her hands pressed flat against the warm stone. The idea of forging an alliance with Petyr Baelish made her stomach coil. But she also knew that in King's Landing, such distasteful partnerships might be the difference between safety and destruction. She gave a tight nod. "I will remember, Lord Baelish." His gaze lingered on her face as though searching for some echo of the girl she had been. "The North remembers, they say. Let us hope you do as well." With that, he stepped back, offered a slight bow, and moved away, his footsteps soft on the ramparts. Sansa let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. She turned her gaze back toward the sea, trying to quell the roiling uncertainty in her heart. The birth of her child was drawing closer, and with it, the unstoppable tide of politics. Everyone in the Red Keep was already scheming how to use the future heir as a piece on their chessboard. She was determined not to let them devour her child, but she also knew how little power she truly held on her own. She had Joffrey's ear, yes, but Joffrey's favor was fickle. Petyr Baelish was right, she had to think beyond mere survival. She could not let House Stark's name vanish behind the gilded stag and lion. She had to find a way to secure a future for the North. That night, she dreamt of Winterfell's snow-covered courtyards. She saw her mother sitting beneath the weirwood tree, the red leaves drifting about her. She saw Ned Stark's kind face, sorrowful as he took the black. She saw Robb pacing the battlements, glancing south with longing and frustration. Then a swirl of cold wind whipped it all away, and she stood in the great hall of the Red Keep, alone, while Joffrey's laughter echoed from unseen corners. She woke with a gasp, tears in her eyes, heart hammering. Joffrey slept on beside her, oblivious. She lay there in the darkness, one hand on her stomach, wondering if her child's life might be bound to this place forever. Over the next moon's turn, she noticed an intensification of tension at court. Rumors spread that bandits in the Riverlands were growing bolder, launching raids near the border with the Westerlands. Tywin responded by moving troops closer, but he kept them under tight control, likely hoping to bait the Tullus into a mistake. Sansa feared that if one of these raids went awry, Joffrey might decide to unleash the royal armies, igniting a war that could draw in Robb Stark. She spoke to Joffrey repeatedly, suggesting that a strong defensive line would be enough, that a negotiated settlement might be more economical. He listened, though his eyes grew restless. She could feel his desire to prove his kingship in a glorious battle. Only the promise that fathering a child made him a man, a true king, seemed to temper his eagerness for bloodshed. She also saw that Margaery Tyrell was holding private talks with Cersei. Sansa gleaned that the Tyrells wanted certain guarantees: a marriage between a younger Tyrell cousin and Prince Tommen, or else the extension of more seats on the small council for Tyrell allies. The Lannisters might accept such terms if it meant securing the grain and gold of Highgarden. Sansa half-hoped these negotiations would succeed, for it could stabilize the south, leaving fewer potential enemies to challenge Joffrey's reign. The safer Joffrey's throne, the safer Sansa's child, and the north by extension. One hot summer morning, Sansa sat beside Joffrey as he presided over the throne room, hearing more disputes. The air felt stifling, even with the huge doors thrown open. Servants fanned them with peacock feathers, but sweat beaded on her forehead. She was nearly 8 moons along now, and the weight of the unborn babe pressed on her lungs, making every breath shallow. Joffrey seemed as impatient as ever, shifting in the Iron Throne. Then a herald announced a petitioner from the Riverlands, Ser Mark Piper, a minor lord sworn to Riverrun. He entered, dusty from travel, bowing low. "Your Grace," he said, voice tight with weariness, "I come to beg your intervention. Raiders bearing the sigil of House Lannister, led by one Ser Gregor Clegane, have burned villages along the banks of the Red Fork. My Lord Father implores you to recall them." A murmur rippled through the throne room. Joffrey's eyes narrowed. "Ser Gregor acts under whose orders?" he demanded, glancing at Cersei, who stood behind him, and then at the small council members who watched. Cersei made a show of ignorance, though Sansa suspected the truth. Gregor Clegane was Tywin's creature used to sow fear. Cersei lifted her hands. "If my Lord Father commanded such, I have not been informed, but we all know Gregor's methods are his own. He may be punishing bandits or pacifying the area." Ser Mark Piper pressed on. "Your Grace, there were no bandits, only small folk, and some were flayed or tormented beyond reason. My father begs you to recall these men, or we will be forced to defend ourselves." Sansa's heart pounded. If the Tully banner men rose, the scale of conflict could escalate quickly. She glanced at Joffrey, wishing she could whisper in his ear, but the entire throne room was watching. Joffrey tapped his fingers on the arm of the throne, looking to the king's guard and then to his mother, uncertain. Finally he barked, "Summon Ser Gregor to answer for these accusations. If he's taken it upon himself to harass loyal subjects, he will face my judgment." The king paused as if expecting applause. But Ser Mark pressed his luck. "And until then, Your Grace, will you command a halt to all raids? Will you forbid House Lannister's men from crossing into our lands?" Joffrey's face darkened. He was not used to being asked for more once he had given an answer. The hot air seemed to spark his temper. "You dare question my justice?" He leaned forward, eyes gleaming dangerously. "I am the king. You do not make demands of me. Be grateful I allow you to speak." Ser Mark blanched. "Forgive me, Your Grace. Sansa felt the tension coil in Joffrey. He might order the man seized or punished for insolence. She steeled herself, rising to her feet with as much regal bearing as she could muster. "My king," she said, letting her voice carry. "Surely the realm knows your fairness. If you command Ser Gregor to cease until he has answered your summons, all the Riverlands will rejoice at your just rule. It will only bolster your glory in their eyes." She let the final words linger. "Bolster your glory." Joffrey's face flickered with a mixture of anger and vanity. Then he sat back, exhaling sharply. "Yes, yes, indeed," he said, loud enough to be heard. "Until I have heard Ser Gregor's testimony, no raids shall be carried out in the Riverlands. Let it be written." Ser Mark sagged in relief. Bowing deeply, he murmured, "Thank you, Your Grace. My Lord Father will praise your mercy." He rose and left. Joffrey glowered at Sansa. She sensed he hated that she had stepped in, but the eyes of the court were upon them. He forced a thin smile. "Such is the wisdom of my lady queen," he said, though the tone was tight. "Now enough of this. Bring in the next petitioner." Sansa sank back into her seat, heart still pounding. She hoped the respite she had secured would defuse the situation in the Riverlands, at least long enough for cooler heads to prevail. But she knew Tywin might resent such an open recall of his men. She was caught between these powers, trying to weave a precarious peace. When the day's audiences ended, Joffrey swept out without a word to her, heading for his private chambers. Sansa followed at a distance, ignoring the sly looks of courtiers who sensed a confrontation brewing. She caught up with him just outside the royal apartments. "My king," she said softly, "please wait." He spun around, face twisted in a snarl. "Why did you speak over me?" "I had given an order," he hissed. "The gall of that man to demand so much, and then you make me look weak by offering him more." Sansa lowered her gaze in a show of humility. "I beg your pardon. I only sought to magnify your reputation for fairness." Carefully, she placed a hand on her belly, a reminder of the child. "I want your subjects to praise you, to love you as well as fear you. That way, if ever rebellion stirs, you will have their loyalty." He glanced at her abdomen, some of his anger ebbing. Then he clenched his jaw. "You must never make me look uncertain in front of the court, do you understand? I am the king, not you." She bowed her head. "Yes, my king. Forgive me." He stood there, chest heaving, for a long moment. Then he moved closer, lifting her chin with a tense hand, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Be mindful, Sansa," he said in a taut voice. "I keep you near me because you have proven useful. But if ever I think you intend to undermine me, if ever you cross me, child or no child," his grip tightened slightly, enough to hurt. She forced herself not to flinch. "I understand." Her voice trembled, but she spoke clearly. After a few heartbeats, he released her. Without another word, he strode inside, leaving her in the corridor, her heart thundering. Tears stung her eyes, but she fought them back, refusing to be seen weeping by the passing servants. She reminded herself that she had averted a worse crisis, perhaps saved many lives in the Riverlands, and that Joffrey's anger, while terrifying, had not broken her. Still, her body shook with aftershocks of fear. That night, she suffered strong pains in her back and lower belly. The maester was summoned, diagnosing them as false labor pains brought on by stress. He gave her a tisane of lemon balm and poppy seeds to help her sleep. She drifted into a troubled rest, dreams of burning villages and a monstrous wolf devouring a crown. She awoke at dawn, exhausted but determined to press on. Over the next few days, as word of the recalled raids spread, Sansa observed subtle shifts in court. Some courtiers praised the king's mercy, but others quietly complained that he had humiliated Tywin by countermanding Gregor's mission. She could only imagine Tywin's reaction when that news reached him in the field. Marjorie offered a few consoling words, but Sansa sensed that the Tyrells were mostly relieved that open war had been postponed, which allowed them to solidify trade routes and influence. A fortnight later, letters arrived that Tywin was returning to King's Landing with Ser Gregor in tow, or so the reports claimed. Sansa braced herself for the confrontation. If Gregor Clegane appeared before the king, he would offer the typical excuses: the Riverlands were harboring bandits, or he believed he was acting in service to the crown. Would Joffrey punish him as a sign of authority, or would he capitulate to Tywin? Sansa knew either choice was dangerous. Punishing Gregor might undermine Tywin's hold in the west, sparing him might spark the Riverlord's wrath. On the day Tywin Lannister arrived, horns sounded at the city gates. A column of troops bearing the crimson and gold lion entered, shimmering in the sun. Word spread that Tywin had pitched his tents outside the walls, presumably to show that he was not there to occupy the city. But he came to the Red Keep with a small retinue of knights, Gregor Clegane among them, a towering man with dead eyes. Sansa felt her stomach turn at the sight of the mountain. She recalled tales of the atrocities he had committed: raping, pillaging, burning. She prayed Joffrey would not see that monster as a convenient tool. In the throne room, as torches flickered, Tywin walked up the aisle, his gait regal, golden hair streaked with silver but still commanding. He knelt, if only briefly, before Joffrey. Sansa stood at Joffrey's side, feeling the hush in the chamber. Joffrey addressed him in a resonant voice. "Lord Tywin, we have received disturbing reports of your man, Ser Gregor, terrorizing the Riverlands without direct orders from the crown." Tywin rose, expression a mask of composure. "Your Grace, I regret that you have been troubled by such reports. As I understand it, my knight merely pursued outlaws who threatened trade along the roads. That some lords of the Riverlands took offense at his methods is unfortunate. Sansa watched Joffrey's face, seeing the flicker of uncertainty. The boy king disliked contradicting Tywin, but he also wanted to appear strong. She hoped he would weigh the costs carefully. Ser Gregor stood behind Tywin, silent and menacing, the hilt of his massive sword glinting. Joffrey hesitated. "We must ensure the safety of all our subjects," he declared. "If Ser Gregor's actions have gone beyond the realm of reason, he must be held to account. I command him to remain in the city until the matter is investigated." Tywin's jaw tightened. It was a small slight to keep Gregor effectively under guard, but one that signaled Joffrey's mistrust. Yet Tywin inclined his head. "As you wish, your grace. Ser Gregor and I shall remain at your disposal until the truth is ascertained." There was a ripple of uneasy approval among some of the assembled lords. Sansa felt her heartbeat steadying. Once again, Joffrey had shown a measure of restraint, not openly condoning Gregor's raids. But she saw the tension simmering in Tywin's eyes. She knew that the formidable Lord of Casterly Rock would not be bested so easily. He had come to King's Landing for a reason, perhaps to remind Joffrey who truly held the realm's power. In the days that followed, Tywin took up rooms in the Red Keep, conferring with Cersei and Jaime behind closed doors. Sansa gleaned that they were pressing Joffrey to let Gregor leave for the western borders again. But Joffrey stalled, not wanting to appear weak after publicly recalling Gregor. For her part, Sansa continued to counsel a cautious approach, urging a thorough investigation, though privately she doubted the inquiry would reveal anything they did not already know. Gregor was Tywin's instrument of terror, and the Riverlands remained on the brink. Meanwhile, the child in her womb stirred more frequently. She felt soft kicks, often at night. A new wave of protectiveness welled up in her, mingled with fear of what sort of world her child would inherit. She wrote letters to her mother, telling her only that she was well, that the realm remained in fragile balance. She received no new letters from her father, which worried her. She prayed that he was safe at the wall. She sent ravens north, but so far no reply came. Perhaps the harsh conditions or the intermittent threats beyond the wall delayed his letters. Another moon passed. Tywin remained in King's Landing, moving chess pieces across the board of the Seven Kingdoms with quiet cunning. Joffrey tried to appear unconcerned, taking solace in archery practices or lavish feasts. Ser Gregor lingered, a silent threat overshadowing any talk of real justice for the Riverlands. Sansa found it harder to walk for long periods, her belly large enough to slow her movements, but she continued to attend council sessions, her presence more vital than ever to keep Joffrey's temper from sparking. Then, late one night, as she was drifting to sleep, the first real contraction came. A sharp, twisting pain seized her abdomen. She gasped, clenching the sheets. Joffrey stirred beside her, demanding to know what was happening. Another wave of pain hit, and she realized with dread and awe, the babe was coming. She was early, only 8 moons and a half by her reckoning. Fear hammered in her heart. Could the child survive if born prematurely? She had heard stories of babes born too soon, mewling weakly, sometimes lost to the stranger's embrace. Her cry alerted the servants. Maester Pycelle was summoned, along with the royal midwives. Guards bustled in the COR. Riders uncertain if it was an attack or simply the queen's labor. Sansa found herself in the midst of chaos, sweat streaming down her face, tears leaking from her eyes as the pains grew more frequent. Joffrey stood at a distance, wide-eyed, uncertain of what to do. "Fetch the queen mother." Pycelle croaked, and moments later, Cersei arrived, sweeping in with a commanding air. She pushed Joffrey aside and bent over Sansa, pressing a cool hand to her brow. "Breathe, girl," Cersei ordered, surprisingly gentle. "You must stay calm." Sansa panted, her hair clinging to her cheeks, her shift soaked. The midwives bustled around her, preparing cloths and hot water. Pycelle hovered, muttering about breech births and the viability of babes born early. She felt terror coursing through her. She had no mother here to guide her, only Cersei, who had once viewed her as an enemy. But at this moment, Cersei's face held a grim compassion as if recalling her own labors. Time lost meaning. The agony crashed over Sansa in waves. She clutched the sheets, crying out at times, cursing and sobbing. Joffrey, pale as bone, asked if he should stay, and Cersei snapped at him that a birthing room was no place for a man enused to blood. He retreated, though Sansa saw fear in his eyes. Perhaps in his own way he worried for her. Or for the child. The midwives urged her on, "Push, my lady, push." She tried. She felt as though her body would tear apart. She screamed, tears streaking her face, but she pushed again and again while sweat drenched her hair. She felt a swirl of dizziness, a lurch in her stomach. Dimly, she heard Cersei's voice, calm but firm. "Keep your eyes open, Sansa. Breathe." Then, all at once, the pressure released. A wail rose in the chamber, thin and piercing. Sansa sagged, sobbing with relief, her heart slamming in her chest. The midwife held up a small, wriggling form covered in blood and fluids. Another midwife rushed forward with towels, wiping the tiny babe clean. For one awful moment, Sansa could not see if it breathed. Then she heard the whimpering cry again, a strong cry. A girl, she realized, glimpsing the babe's form. The midwife announced it, "A girl, your grace." A girl. Sansa could only close her eyes in gratitude. The child lived. The midwife brought the babe to her chest, swaddled in white cloth, and Sansa looked down at her daughter's face. Tiny, pink, her eyes squeezed shut, mouth scrunched in a protest at the sudden brightness of the world. Sansa's breath caught. She stroked a trembling hand over the soft fuzz of the baby's hair, damp and golden brown. "She's early, but her lungs are strong," one midwife observed. "She stands a good chance if she takes the breast and avoids fever." Sansa nodded, tears filling her eyes. She had done it. She had brought a new life into the world, fragile though it was. Cersei stood to the side, arms folded, a complex expression crossing her features. She seemed almost moved, though she masked it quickly. The babe's cries grew louder, hungry. One of the midwives guided Sansa, helping her position the infant. With surprising eagerness, the child latched on, suckling with a feeble but determined grip. Sansa's tears spilled freely. Relief warred with exhaustion. She was alive, her daughter was alive. She dared not imagine how quickly politics would move around this new piece on the board. When the bleeding had lessened and they had cleaned Sansa, Joffrey was summoned. He entered, stepping carefully as though afraid to see something that might offend his sensibilities. His gaze fell on the infant at Sansa's breast. The midwives retreated discreetly and Cersei watched from a few paces away. "A girl?" Joffrey asked, his tone uncertain as though he'd expected a son. Sansa swallowed, speaking hoarsely. "A girl," she confirmed. She eased the babe away from her breast, letting Joffrey see the tiny face. "Your daughter, my king." He stared, lips parted. For a heartbeat, he looked almost disappointed. Then the infant gave a small cry, and he tentatively reached out a hand, brushing a finger against her cheek. "She's small. She came early," Sansa managed, voice shaky. "But the midwives believe she'll be strong." Joffrey said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded curtly. "We shall name her," he began, glancing at his mother. "What name befits a princess of the realm?" Cersei approached, eyes flicking from Joffrey to Sansa, as if awarding them both grudging approval. "Perhaps Myrcella, to honor your sister," Cersei suggested. Joffrey grimaced. "That's too similar. I want something new, something regal." Sansa found herself speaking before she could quell her impulse. "We might name her for a queen of old, like Riella or Nymeria or—" She stopped, realizing she was about to name Targaryen or Dornish queens, which might be ill-received. "Or we can choose a name from the Baratheon line, perhaps Cassandra. She was a storm queen of old, was she not?" Cersei's expression tightened at the mention of older lineages, but Joffrey considered it. "Cassandra," he repeated. "Yes, that has a certain ring to it. Princess Cassandra of House Baratheon." He gave a small nod. "She will be called Cassandra." Relief swept over Sansa that he had not outright rejected her suggestion. She gave the babe a tender look. Cassandra, her daughter. She prayed that the name would not be overshadowed by Lannister cunning or Baratheon ferocity. Cersei stepped forward to peer at the infant. "She resembles you, Sansa, the shape of the face." Her tone was carefully neutral. Sansa glanced up, uncertain whether that was a compliment or a veiled concern. She offered a small nod. "Perhaps she'll have some of her father's features as she grows." Joffrey cleared his throat, still looking ill at ease. "Well, see that she's given the best care," he announced, as if the matter were concluded. "Mother, arrange a wet nurse. Sansa must rest." "This has been a trying night." He turned away, striding out before Sansa could reply. Cersei lingered a moment, her gaze lingering on the child in Sansa's arms. She spoke quietly. It isn't easy raising children in King's Landing. Keep that in mind. There was a hint of sympathy in her voice, perhaps recalling how she had lost Myrcella to a marriage alliance, how Tommen's safety was always precarious. Then she inclined her head and followed Joffrey. Once they were gone, Sansa finally allowed herself to breathe. The chamber was quiet, the only sound the infant's soft whimpers. Exhaustion weighed on Sansa like a lead cloak, but also a trembling sense of wonder. She cradled Cassandra close, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple, inhaling the warm scent of her new daughter. In the following days, Sansa recovered slowly. Maester Pycelle insisted on bed rest. The midwives hovered, ensuring Cassandra fed well and that Sansa's bleeding did not worsen. Joffrey visited occasionally, always brief. He would stand and observe the baby, sometimes letting Sansa place her in his arms. He held the child stiffly, uncertain but not unkind. Sansa found it odd to see Joffrey with a newborn in his grasp. A swirl of contradictory emotions flickered on his face: pride, curiosity, perhaps fear. The court erupted with talk of the new princess. Gifts arrived in a stream: tiny golden rattles, embroidered blankets, tokens from lords seeking favor. Sansa accepted them all, though the pomp made her anxious. Everyone wanted to claim a piece of the newest royal. Even Marjorie Tyrell arrived with a small silver cradle ornamented with roses, bowing graciously to Sansa. "For the little flower in our midst," Marjorie said with a warm smile. "May she grow to be as beautiful as her mother." Sansa thanked her softly, managing a smile. She was grateful that the birth seemed to have come without major complications for the child. The realm saw it as a sign of continued stability. Yet Sansa knew that little had changed in the grand scheme. Tywin and Joffrey still clashed behind closed doors. Gregor's presence loomed. The Riverlands seethed. Now, though, she had a new personal stake: her daughter's future. She would do anything to protect Cassandra. About 2 weeks after the birth, when Sansa was well enough to walk short distances, she ventured to the courtyard to feel sunlight on her face. The babe slept in a covered cradle behind her, guarded by a nurse. Sansa stood by a rosebush, inhaling the scent of the blossoms. A swirl of memory rose in her. She remembered picking winter roses in the glass gardens at Winterfell, their blue petals so delicate against the northern snow. She felt an ache for home so deep she could scarcely breathe. She sensed a presence and turned to see Joffrey approaching, accompanied by 2 gold cloaks. He dismissed them with a wave, stepping closer. "You're out of bed," he observed, glancing at her pale face. She inclined her head. "I've grown stronger, my king. The maester said I may walk a bit." He peered into the cradle, where Cassandra slept peacefully. The nurse stood aside, bowing. "She's so quiet," Joffrey muttered. "Hardly cries at all. Is that normal?" "I suppose so," Sansa said softly. "She's a calm babe." He stared at the tiny figure, then looked at Sansa. There was something uneasy in his gaze, as though he were uncertain how to feel about fatherhood. "My mother says I should have a great feast to celebrate the princess's name day, but I see no point in lavishing more coin on extravagance. We've had enough feasts." Sansa nodded. "True, the small folk might appreciate it, but times are still uncertain. Perhaps a simpler celebration, a distribution of bread and ale to the poor. That might endear you to them even more." He seemed to consider her words. "Yes, perhaps. That's a good idea." She mustered a small smile, still wary after his recent outburst. "Whatever you decide, my king, I support you." He studied her face. "You always have your suggestions, your gentle corrections, don't you?" His voice carried a note of accusation, but not as sharp as before. She held his gaze. "I only seek to help you. I am your wife. I want to see you succeed." He shrugged, looking away. "Then see that you do not overstep." He turned on his heel but paused, glancing back at the cradle. For a moment he looked almost fond. Then he walked away, leaving Sansa to wonder if fatherhood might mellow him, or if it would only make him more dangerous. In the weeks that followed, Sansa slowly resumed her place at Joffrey's side in the throne room. She wore looser gowns, her figure no longer swollen with pregnancy but still recovering. Cassandra was kept in a royal nursery, attended by trusted nurses. Sansa found reasons to visit her daughter often between audiences, pressing gentle kisses to the baby's brow. watching in wonder as Cassandra's tiny hands curled around her finger. She had never felt such fierce love, nor such fear that she might lose this fragile life. Letters from the north arrived sporadically, mostly from her mother, cautiously optimistic about the peace. Catelyn was relieved to hear of the baby's safe birth, though Sansa sensed her mother's heartbreak in every word. Her first grandchild, born in King's Landing to a boy who had exiled Ned Stark. As for Ned, no direct letters came, though Sansa finally received a note from the Night's Watch steward, stating that Lord Stark was on a ranging beyond the wall, out of Raven's reach for some time. Worry gnawed at her. What dangers lurked beyond that icy barrier? Wildlings, others, but she could only pray the gods watched over him. One morning, Sansa heard a rumor that Robb Stark might be journeying south to attend a parley at Harrenhal, a parley arranged by Tywin to settle Riverland's disputes. If Robb came, it would be the first time she had seen him in so long. Her heart leapt at the thought of reuniting, but also clenched in dread. If the negotiations went poorly, it could lead to war. She found herself longing for a chance to speak to her brother, to ensure the North would remain safe. Days blurred into one another as Joffrey tried to juggle Tywin's demands, the small council's bickering, and his own desire for glory. Sansa used what sway she could to keep him from lashing out, employing well-timed flattery and appeals to his image as a merciful king. She wove a quiet pattern of influence, reassuring allies like the Tyrells, tempering the Lannisters' thirst for dominance, and reminding Joffrey that his child needed a stable realm. At night, she sometimes brought Cassandra into their chambers to show Joffrey how the infant had grown. He would hold her stiffly, then eventually pass her back. Once, in a rare moment of softness, he asked Sansa if the child looked more like him or like her. Sansa answered that Cassandra had his coloring, but her features might be from House Stark. She saw him frown at that, but he did not grow angry. Instead, he kissed Cassandra's brow, as if claiming the child regardless of her northern blood. Yet the Red Keep remained a crucible of intrigue. Peter Baelish still hovered, offering cryptic remarks about the child's future. Varys popped in and out, a watchful presence. Cersei oversaw the infant's upbringing with a keen eye, sometimes insisting on certain Lannister-approved nurses. Jaime came and went, apparently uninterested in the baby but ever watchful of Joffrey's rule. Tywin lingered, pressing for expansions of power in the Westerlands. Gregor Clegane roamed the castle, unpunished yet contained, a reminder that brutality simmered just below the surface of this tenuous peace. As the leaves turned golden in the Kingswood beyond the city, preparations were made for a grand assembly at Harrenhal, a chance to gather the lords of the Trident, Tywin's banners, and possibly representatives from the north. Joffrey decided he would go in person, taking Sansa with him to demonstrate the unity of the realm. They would travel by wheelhouse, an entourage of hundreds. The announcement sent a ripple through the city, for the king leaving the capital always stirred excitement and potential unrest. On the eve of their departure, Sansa held Cassandra close, struggling with the notion of bringing such a small infant on the road. But Joffrey insisted their daughter accompany them, to show the realm its new princess. And perhaps, Sansa reflected, it might allow her to see Robb or other family in relative safety. She prayed it would not plunge them into the jaws of war. That night, as she fed Cassandra in the gentle glow of lanterns, she allowed herself a moment of quiet hope. For all her fears, she had shaped this reality. Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, but he had not launched a full-scale war against her kin. Ned Stark was alive, exiled yet breathing. The North had not seceded. A child lay in her arms, bridging the line between Stark and Baratheon and Lannister. A child that might someday rule a realm more peaceful than the one her father had inherited. Yet she knew how fragile that hope was. All it would take was one betrayal, one whim of Joffrey's cruelty unleashed, one unstoppable ambition from Tywin or Cersei, and the realm would burn. She cradled Cassandra's small head, humming a lullaby she half remembered from Winterfell, letting the notes soothe her as much as the babe. In her mind, she prayed to both the old gods and the new. Let them be safe. Let her father return from the wall unharmed. Let Robb remain cautious. Let Joffrey continue to heed her counsel. Let this child see a world without war. She laid Cassandra in a cradle lined with soft furs, stroking her hair until the infant's eyes drifted shut in sleep. Then Sansa sank into a chair, exhausted, tears welling once again. She was only a girl of 17, yet she felt centuries old, burdened by secrets and responsibilities. The path she had carved to tame Joffrey's cruelty had led her here, mother to a princess, queen in all but name, a linchpin in the fragile peace of the Seven Kingdoms. And on the morrow, they would depart for Harrenhal, that cursed fortress of melted towers. The stage was set for the next dance of power, where Tywin might confront the River Lords, where Robb might appear with the banners of the North, where the seeds of old grudges might sprout anew. Sansa knew she would have to stand at Joffrey's side, playing the queen, stifling her own terror, whispering the words that could save them all or doom them. She did not know how it would end. She only knew she had come too far to yield. Her father's life, her brother's future, her daughter's safety, all hung on her ability to keep Joffrey's darker impulses contained. If she failed, war would consume them all. But if she succeeded, there might be a chance, just a chance, of a realm at peace, an iron throne secured not by fear alone, but by a queen's gentle guidance. For now, she would gather her strength, hold her child close, and rise again with the dawn. Come what may, Sansa Stark would continue her mission. She was both a daughter of the North and a queen of the South, bound to a cruel king but tempering him through subtlety, cunning, and carefully placed hope. The next chapter of her story loomed on the horizon, just beyond the broken towers of Harrenhal, and she would face it as she had faced every trial so far, with grace, caution, and an unwavering devotion to preserving the lives she held dear.